So, yeah, what I was saying was today we are doing first principles Kubernetes constructs, which is something I invented. Like, oh, there you go. That was one of the quotes that you just saw. Obnoxious quote. And then this was my response to them. Okay, where did it go? Like, this is the price they quoted, and then I gave just slashed everything in half. Okay, this is what I can pay. Then they said no. I was like, okay. Pin me, make me smaller. Alrighty. So, what I was saying was first principles Kubernetes. So abhi tak na we have done a few things. We have in the non-Kubernetes world understood how to deploy apps, how to use Nginx for reverse proxy, how to use certbot for certificate management. We understand this very well from first principles, how to deploy our application on the internet on a virtual machine. We have not done that yet in Kubernetes. We are close. We understood services the last week. We understood a load balancer service, a node port service. We were able to make an application accessible on the internet. What we did not learn last week was number one, cluster IPs. So this will be useful when you deploy DBs/Redis in your Kubernetes cluster. So this is one thing we will learn today. Number two, ingress is a slightly Kubernetes jargon. It's used in a lot of places. It's a specific Kubernetes jargon also. This doesn't come by default in Kubernetes. Kubernetes does not have ingress by default. आपको लानी पड़ती है. So before we bring ingress into the picture, we'll understand how can we build ingress from first principles. This is something we did not do in cohort 2. Cohort 2 we just brought in ingress, made it work. This time, since we know this, we understand Nginx and reverse proxy, why can't we build an ingress of our own? So that's what one thing we'll learn. And then if we get the time, again, certificate management is done using something called cert manager in Kubernetes. But again, why can't we do this using first principles if we already know how certbot and certificate management works in the non-Kubernetes world? So we'll try to do both of these things. I'm unsure if we'll reach the second one. Probably should be able to. First one we'll definitely do. In the process, we're going to learn about number one, services. We already done services, but a new type of service called cluster IP. We'll understand about what is that called? Namespaces. We'll understand how to reach internal services. And if we get the time, we'll understand how can you create your own certificates. So manual certificates in Kubernetes. You should not do this eventually. This is just first principles slowly trying to build up. Eventually, we will use ingresses. We will use certmanager.io. We will not create all of this from first principles ourselves. But abhi ke liye, slowly trying to understand how do these two external services work under the hood. By external services, I mean, ये Kubernetes में नहीं आती हैं. Just like pods is a thing, deployment is a thing, in replica set is a thing, services are a thing. Ingress and certmanager.io, whatever, certificate resources or certificate, objects. Pod is an object, deployment is an object, replica set is an object. Ingress and certificate objects don't come by default. You can bring them to your Kubernetes cluster. We are not bringing them to our Kubernetes cluster today. We're like, screw this. We're going to write something similar ourselves. Okay? So that's the high level. With that, we'll kick things off by creating a very simple Node.js application connected to a database and try to deploy it in a Kubernetes cluster, which means you need a Kubernetes cluster, my friends. Unfortunately, you can't run things locally today. आज हम load balancer services को use करेंगे. We will use a load balancer service. If you remember from last week, this does not work locally. इसके लिए आपको एक real Kubernetes cluster चाहिए. So with me, create a fresh Kubernetes cluster wherever you want. Could be in DigitalOcean, could be in Vultr, could be in AWS, could be in GCP. These are simple. GCP and AWS are a little hard. Eventually, when we get to provisioning clusters in AWS, we'll understand about EKS CUTL, which is, Elastic Kubernetes Service CUTL, whatever CUTL stands for, I keep forgetting, to, create a cluster over there. It's very hard to create a Kubernetes cluster using a dashboard in AWS. Very easy over here. If I click on create, I click on Kubernetes, it opens, a default window for me. I will select the standard version of Kubernetes that they have. If I want, I can select an older version. Which data center am I running it in? I will select Bangalore. You can select whatever you want. Ignore this give it a name, call it backend week, I don't even remember, but probably we're at week 35 or 36, something like that. Shared CPU is fine, basic machine is fine, $24 a month is great. 3 node cluster, simple. 3 node cluster hum bana rahe hain. It amounts to $70 a month, which is great for 3 machines. That's not too bad. Of course, these are small machines, so you can't run too many things here. But then you're good to go. I'm going to create a fresh Kubernetes cluster on my DigitalOcean. You need to do something similar. You can't use Minikube or a Kind to run it locally. For today, आज हम locally नहीं run कर पाएंगे. This is probably week 3 of Kubernetes. By now, you should have a Kubernetes cluster somewhere out on the internet. But Harkirat, it's $72. It is fine. It is you investing, and you can always decrease the number of nodes to just one also, and just pay $24 a month, which is bare minimum you should pay for whatever having a Kubernetes cluster on the internet. Civo is probably cheaper and also gives you $250 in credits for a month. So you can also go to civo.com and get yourself a Kubernetes cluster from here. Steps are very similar. Create a cluster, wait for it to provision. When it provisions is when we're going to connect to it. So let's just wait for it to provision. Meanwhile, I look at Q&A if someone has any questions. But what I'm doing right now is just creating Kubernetes cluster. Quick recap of what we are doing. So what we are doing is deploying a Node.js backend, which connects to a database in a Kubernetes cluster. So we're deploying our database to a Kubernetes cluster. We're deploying our backend app to the Kubernetes cluster. If we get the time, we'll deploy the front end as well. So, all three of these we're trying to deploy in a Kubernetes cluster. That involves some things we have learned until this week, some things we're going to learn eventually. What about Azure? You can create one. I've tried to create one. Somewhere I got stuck, I left. I forget why I was creating a cube. I remember. So if you want to run code, what is that called? Judge Zero. You can unfortunately run it inside Kubernetes only in Azure. There are a few reasons as to why. I can dive deeper into them later. But you can't run Judge Zero, which is a library that you use for remote code execution on most clouds. You can run it on Azure though. That's why I tried it. Did not work. So I just did not make it run there. app.handexters.com. No slides today. So there are slides. You should probably go to Kubernetes part 2, but they're all over the place. These are cohort 2 slides. And the structure is a little different, but yeah, a lot of things we're covering are going to be in the slides. So let's go through the slides. These are the slides for today. Kubernetes part 2. We have learned about these. I hope you guys understand these by now. Clusters, nodes, pods, deployments, and replica sets. What we're learning today is namespaces. We are not learning these two just yet. We'll probably discuss this next week on an offline video. But we are trying to build something very similar to what these guys provide you. So if you learn today, you don't really need an ingress, but of course ingress has some benefits, so you should use it. And we'll learn about config maps also today. We might not need secrets today, so we'll ignore them. We'll learn them next week basically. So config maps, namespaces, and some level of ingress is what we're learning today. So these slides are mildly relevant. Yeah, and cert management is what we'll discuss eventually. Volumes and persistent volumes and resource management also. And this also. These are all important topics we have to cover. But abhi hum thoda piche hain, so we're going to just learn about some of these. Cool. Is my Kubernetes cluster provisioned? And the answer is no. Let me refresh. And suddenly the answer is still no. So I will wait. Meanwhile, while this is happening, what are the things we're supposed to learn today? All of these. So let's learn about namespaces while the cluster is provisioning. It's a very simple thing. So we can hash it out really quickly. Go to the slides, select namespaces over here. So slide number 9. Let me paste it in the chat as well. Let's quickly hash out what are namespaces. In Kubernetes, a namespace is a way to divide your cluster resources. What is a resource? Pod, deployment, service, between multiple users and teams. Now, if you are part of Google, for example, bad example, but let's say a startup like Notion. Notion will have a backend team, a front-end team, a monitoring team, a platform team, a real-time team, bunch of teams, right? अब ऐसा थोड़ी है कि every team has their own Kubernetes cluster. They will have a single Kubernetes cluster. So, if there are hundreds of teams in Notion, and I am a developer in Notion and I do kubectl get pods, will it not show me the pods of all the teams? Yes, sir. अगर एक ही Kubernetes cluster है, which is a good idea, you don't need to shard based on teams. कि team 1 gets this Kubernetes cluster, team to get this Kubernetes cluster? You can, but generally single cluster is where you put all of your teams ka sari deployments, sari applications, everything. Problem is, if I am a developer in the backend team, I run kubectl get pods. I see the pods of the front-end team. Such a long list. How will I scroll and find my relevant pods? Here comes the concept of namespaces. Namespaces, very similar to namespaces in C++. If you've done use std, use namespace std, or std cout, something like this. If you've used namespacing in Kubernetes, sorry, in C++, very similar to namespaces here. When you do kubectl get pods, you don't get all the pods. I repeat, you don't get all the pods. You get all the pods in the default namespace. So here comes another Kubernetes resource, namespace. Let me do kubectl get namespace. And you will see, it tells me, Harkira, there is a default namespace and a bunch of other kube public namespace, kube system namespace, kube node lease namespace. All of these namespaces have some pods running, have some services running, have some deployments running. When I do kubectl get pods, I get all the pods in the default namespace. But यहाँ पे भी pods run हो सकते हैं. They might be running, they might not be running. For example, if I do kubectl get pods -n cube -system, there is another namespace called cube system. If I run kubectl get pods -n cube system, I get all the pods that are running in another namespace. Of course, these aren't started by me manually. Kubernetes has them running by default. So what does that tell you? There are a bunch of pods running. You don't see the whole picture when you do kget pods. You only see your own manually generated pods. But more technically, you only see pods in the default namespace. If you ever create something like this, don't worry about the whole thing. But very simply, if you try to create a deployment where the metadata has name backend, ये default namespace में ही start होगा. This will start in the default namespace. But if I do this namespace backend team, so अब if I run this manifest, if I apply this manifest, this will start the deployment, the replica set, and the pods in a different namespace. So if this is your Kubernetes cluster, which has, let's say machine 1, machine 2, machine 3. On machine 1, I could be running a pod. Machine 2, I could be running a pod. Machine 3 might be running a few pods. Every pod is part of a namespace. हर pod एक namespace का part है. जैसे this might be part of the default namespace. The default namespace. This might be part of the backend team namespace. And maybe this and this, because this is the master node. Master node doesn't really run, pods. So, these two might be in the front-end namespace. हर टीम का आप अलग अलग नेम स्पेस बना सकते हो. उसका फायदा क्या है? What is the benefit? कि यार if I want to see all the pods running in the default namespace, I will see them here. But if I want to see all the pods running in the backend namespace, I can run this. It is saying वहाँ पे तो कोई pod नहीं चल रहा अभी. If I want to see all the pods running in the front-end namespace, I can see it like this. So the benefit is just separation of concern, ताकि थोड़ा easily दिख पाए कि हाँ कोई फर्क नहीं है. ऐसा नहीं है कि backend namespace is running on this node, front-end namespace is running on this node. There is no segregation like that physically. Just a logical segregation. कि whenever you start a service, it starts. Some services start in a namespace. Some services run, default in all namespaces. कुछ चीजों के लिए doesn't make sense for a namespace to exist, but for a pod, it does make sense. So, how can you create a new namespace? You can write a manifest file for it. By the way, आप एक manifest file भी लिख सकते हो कि API version v1 kind manifest name, whatever name you want to give, or you can run this command. Either is fine. But what have we learned? We have learned creating a file is a better idea. Let's do this first, then we'll create a file as well. So kubectl create namespace backend-team. What have I done? I have created a new namespace. Now, if I do kget namespace, it tells me backend team भी एक namespace है. It was created 10 seconds ago. Now, if I look at the pods in the backend dash team namespace, what do you think exists? Nothing. I haven't started a pod yet. But what if I write a manifest? Okay, yaar, API version v1 kind pod name nginx and namespace backend dash team. Now, if I have metadata.namespace set to backend dash team, when I apply this manifest, it will start this in the backend team namespace. तो मैंने क्या change किया in my pod specification? Everything else is the same. This is a standard pod specification we have seen many times. What I'm trying to create is a pod. The name is nginx. Let's remove the labels for now. We don't need them. Let's remove this port as well. This much is a very simple pod specification. Hopefully you guys understand this by now. I want to start a pod. This is the container that will be starting. Name of the container is nginx. This port is exposed. Extra thing I've added is this one line of code, which will now, if I apply this manifest, pod slash nginx is created. But if I do kget pods, I don't see it here. I don't see an nginx pod over here. Why? Because it is created in the backend team namespace. So if I now run kget pods dash n backend team, I see this. If I run simply kget pods, that's the same thing as doing kget pods dash n default. तो डिफॉल्ट नेम स्पेस में तो वो स्टार्ट ही नहीं हुई है. इट स्टार्टेड इन अ डिफरेंट नेम स्पेस. दैट मीन्स नथिंग फिजिकली स्टार्ट हुई है इन अ स्पेसिफिक नेम स्पेस. डजंट मीन स्टार्टेड ऑन डिफरेंट मशीन और स्पेसिफिक मशीन और on a different cluster. It just means it has another label attached to it. Okay, the namespace is backend team. That is why when I do dash n backend dash team, I see that specific pod. If I try to delete it, k delete pod backend team, it says ये तो exist ही नहीं करता. It says error from server, pod backend team not found. Why? Because this pod exists in the backend. Oh, sorry. The name of the pod was nginx. But even if I do this, k delete pod nginx, it doesn't work because default namespace में वो नहीं है. K delete pod nginx is the same as doing this. K delete pod nginx dash n default, which we know does nothing because default namespace में कुछ है ही नहीं. The manifest clearly stated kit exists in a different namespace. It does not exist in the, let's say this was the default namespace blue. It doesn't exist here. It exists in the backend team namespace, which let's say is, this orange pod. So when I delete it, I need to provide it the right namespace. And now it says pod has been deleted. Kget pods dash n backend team. It says no pods found. So do we understand namespaces? Let's quickly go through the slides again. This will return you all the namespaces. This will return you all the pods in a specific namespace. This will let you can create deployments also in a specific namespace. So if I do, let's copy this deployment. It starts nginx, 3 replicas of it. Hopefully you understand this file by now. We have understood deployments. So it just starts a deployment with 3 replicas. That starts the nginx image. So if I copy this and paste it to manifest dash ingress, nginx.yaml, paste it. Notice the namespace is set to backend dash t, which means if I apply manifest dash nginx, if I paste this again, manifest dash nginx, it says the deployment has been created. But if I run kget deployment, the nginx deployment doesn't exist here. There are a bunch of others, but ये वाली exist नहीं कर रही. At the same time, if I do dash n backend dash team, it does exist. So do we get the idea? That also means pods have been started. So kget pods dash n backend team now has 3 pods running. In which namespace? Backend team namespace. फायदा क्या है? Okay, now the backend team can simply run this. Can see 3 pods. They don't have to see the rest of the pods that exist. They can simply see their 3 pods and figure out what's wrong there, what's right there. So every team can get their own namespace. इसके फायदे बाद में भी आएंगे. If you want to eventually access control, कि backend team can't see front-end team का pods, front-end team can't see backend team का pods. When you want to add these aggregations, or sorry, segregations, is when the namespace will actually become important. Abhi ke liye, sort of important. I can read through, the pods of a specific namespace. Great. One more thing to quickly show is this thing called, this command called kubectl config set context. This will change the default namespace. So if I run kubectl config set context -- current -- namespace equal to backend -team. If I set kubectl config set context, I am trying to change my context. कि मैं जब kget pods run करूं, it should not run in the default namespace. It should not be equivalent to this. I want it to be equivalent to this. That is why when you do kubectl config set context -- current -- namespace equal to backend, now if I do kget pods, ये मुझे backend team वाले pods ही दिखाएगा. It will show me my default namespace has become backend -team. If I create another namespace, kubectl create namespace frontend team, and if I do kget pods, ये मुझे backend के दिखा रहा है. If I want, I can see the frontend team के pods as well. None exist right now. If I want, I can see the default namespace के pods as well, which I have 4 of these running. So do we understand namespaces in Kubernetes? Took us 20 minutes. I think that's more than enough for namespaces. Let me revert back to the default namespace. I don't want to be lingering in the backend team namespace, but let's do a poll. Do we understand what are namespaces? To recap, logical concept. Lets you segregate pods, deployments, things like these across various namespaces. So different teams can, see different things separately. Perfect. So what was the goal for today? I'll take it a fair step ahead. Create a full stack application. So front end, back end, and database, and deploy the whole thing to a Kubernetes cluster. Not just one thing, not just back end, not just front end, not just stateless applications. Slightly more, a database which is stateful. It has some state, it has some data that needs to persist. How do you store that in a Kubernetes cluster? Now I have my Kubernetes cluster. My eyes are burning. This is very, very white. But if you look at it, I have a Kubernetes cluster running. Now I'm not recapping the steps, but I've just started a cluster in DigitalOcean, connecting to Kubernetes, manual, and then download the configuration file. You will see similar steps in Civo. It's a little difficult in AWS, but in Civo and in DigitalOcean and even in Vultr, VULTR, steps are very similar. Download the cluster configuration file. It's downloaded for me here. Let me open it. Let me copy this. Let me rename this to config or config.yaml. Let me copy it and let me paste it where ये जो फाइल डाउनलोड हुई थी ये कहाँ जाएगी? In the .cube folder. In the .cube folder, as you can see, I have many files, but this config file is what kubectl picks. I repeat, मेरे पास यहाँ बहुत सारी files हैं. I keep making backups, which is a bad idea, but I do it. But this config file, which now I will replace with what I downloaded from DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean ने मुझे ये दिया. I copied it, pasted it in the .cube folder as config, not config.yaml, just config. So whatever I downloaded from DigitalOcean, ये file मैंने उठाई. Where did I keep it? In the .cube folder in my root folder. Where does this exist? In my root folder /users/Harkirat Singh /.cube. इसके अंदर I created a config file, not config.yaml, not config.json, simply config. वहां पे मैंने वो जो डाउनलोड हुआ था यहाँ पेस्ट कर दिया in this config file. Now if I do kget pods, it says can't connect. So the thing I saw this a while back as well. If I rename this to config, it still it still has an extension called .yaml. So what I'm doing is move config.yaml to config. What did I do? I went to this folder, And then I could have done this, move downloads slash, whatever the downloaded file ka name was, Kubernetes file digitalocean.yaml to .cube/config. तो ये कॉपी करना था. After you copy the file downloaded from DigitalOcean to this location as config, not config.txt, not config.yaml, is when now when you run kubectl get pods, you will see all the pods in your fresh cluster. जो मेरा fresh DigitalOcean cluster है, I have no resources there in the default namespace. I have no services there. I have one default Kubernetes service, that is exposing the Kubernetes API, and I have no deployment. I have no replica sets. Khali Kubernetes cluster is where we have to introduce a backend application now. So, though options hai guys, I have done this already. I have the code here also. I have pushed it there also on the internet. We can go through the code. We can write it from scratch. So let's do a quick poll. Select yes if you want me to go through the code. Very simple express code, ऐसा कुछ है नहीं. But we can write it from scratch also. तो दोनों में से मुझे बता दो. Do you want me to go through the code? Yes or no? If you select no, then I'll close the project. We'll start from scratch. Do you want me to go through the code? Yes or no? So not a very big yes, but a 65% yes. तो मैं slowly जाऊंगा. Don't worry. I know there are a lot of files here. I know it's very jarring. But 10 मिनट पहले ही लिखा है मैंने. बहुत simple stuff है. धीरे धीरे करके समझेंगे. There are 2 high-level folders, Express and Ops. एक तीसरा भी यहाँ add करेंगे. We'll add front end over here. We'll deploy our front end as well. अभी के लिए we have Express, we have Ops. तो would urge you guys to clone it. एक बार clone कर लो ताकि you can also see it. So 100x devs cohort 3. And clone this repository locally. I'll give you guys 2 minutes. Take 2 minutes, clone the repository, open it in VS Code, Cursor, wherever you want, and then we'll go from there. I'll look at Q&A for 2 minutes, then I will start. If I deploy my internet application on the internet using a virtual machine, can I use Docker to store my data in my own virtual machine, just like we're doing now, many times, rather than storing external DB like Superbase DB? So yes, you can. But what happens if your machine dies? Okay, I will restart it. Cool. What if it dies and data goes corrupt? What if it gets terminated? So data ka kya hoga? Hence, you should rely on external services. If you are creating your own database, if you are self-hosting databases and not doing a managed service like Neon or RDS or Superbase, it's fine initially. Eventually, your machine will fill up. You will see Postgres issues. You will go there, you will debug them. You'll make your machine bigger, so on and so forth. Very scary thing to do. Some people do it. Generally, most companies outsource. You don't need to outsource to Neon. Neon gets expensive. You can use RDS. You can get discounts, but generally a good idea to manage databases, not self-host. One useful feature of Kubernetes namespaces is that we can specify permissions to a namespace. That is correct. We're going to learn them eventually when we learn about access control, allowing them to exactly. So one big thing you might want to, great point that Rishabh Mehra has posted, which is if team A needs read access to pods in team B's namespace, an admin can provide team A access to read access to team B's resources, not write access, read access. So you can have very fine-grained control over who can access what. Create a DigitalOcean account, cut the money twice, not just additional information required. Yeah, that happens. And it's for good reason, I can tell you. People in India scam cloud providers like crazy. I have a friend who owes AWS 5 CR, I kid you not. He created a new account and they did not bill him. And he moved to GCP. And now he's in some legal battles, but I don't think he'll have to pay. So yes, it's for good reasons that they don't allow. Well, so they have limits and everything. They can give everyone a free account and make sure you can only create one resource. I don't know. But yeah, cloud providers will be a little finicky. There are a bunch of other things. People use it for blockchain, for mining, for DDoS. So they have to be a little finicky when it comes to initial access. What if we create a cluster, use it for learning, and then delete after 2-3 hours? So it will be $72 a month divided by whatever hours you have used. So if you use it for 1 day, it will be like $2. Cool, we'll get into it. देखो ये कोड अब मत कहना कि नहीं समझ आता है, मैं बहुत मारूंगा. This is very simple. We have learned Express. We have learned PG also, even though we don't use it, we use Prisma. Course we understand. So very simple Express application. There is a slash users endpoint to get all the users in a database. From the database. Slash user endpoint to put all the users in the database, where rec.body.name is what we're putting in the database. So user will give us a name, we'll put an entry in the database. Simple CRUD application. You can make it more complex, but does a get, does a post. Only extra thing I've added is I've written a function called initdb that runs this SQL query first. Create table if not exists users with your schema for the database, which there's an ID field, there's a name field. Why have I done this? Because there is, as we start pods, databases eventually, whenever a database starts ekdam se, it will not have your whatever schema. It will be an empty database. It will not have tables. तो उसमें टेबल कैसे डालेंगे? There are ways. You can somehow, हम अपना database बहुत छुपा के रखेंगे. We will not expose our database on the internet. It's always a bad idea to do that. Another big thing for you, I have access to a few people's databases I shouldn't, but because they have access on the internet open, and somehow I have their passwords, I can go into the database and literally see what they're doing. I will not name whom, but eventually you will know. So you should always keep your database very secure. Only your backend IPs should be able to access the database. Internet पे expose नहीं होना चाहिए, and hence since it is not internet available, we will not be able to run this create table query unless we run it inside our backend only. Because backend to can touch the database, can talk to the database, which is why I've written this initdb function here, which will just initialize this create table if not exists. So अगर exist करता है, beautiful. If it is the first time that the database is being connected to, users table उधर बन जाएगा. Simple get endpoint, simple post endpoint. Corresponding Docker file. Docker file looks like this. From avan/bun latest. So I'm using bun. If you use Node.js, I don't know, whatever other runtimes, this will change. But we're using bun. Bun has its own runtime. This is the base image, working directory, copy over all the code, run bun install, expose 3000, bun index.ts. Very simple stuff. Please tell me this is easy. Eventually we'll write the front end, we'll write everything from scratch also if you want to. Usme front end Docker files are anyways a little more complex, especially if the front end is connected to the database. It probably won't for us. Next.js में हम React front end बनाएंगे. But either way, we can write it from scratch for the front end. Back end का simple है. After, you don't have to do this, but I'm going to do this. If I go to the Express folder, I will run a docker build command that looks like this. Docker build. Now, one important thing for Mac people is you have to build it for Linux. If you build it for Mac, you will see an error. We have seen this in the past. Okay, when we were building it on our Mac machine, pushing to Docker Hub, pulling to a Ubuntu VM, it was not working. And hence, this -- platform equal to Linux AMD 264, we already know. We know. -t, tag it with whatever you want. I have already tagged it with 100x devs /backend-pg :2. Matlab, my final tag is 2. This is the name of the image. This is the tag of the image. Why is it 2 Harkirat? I can get into baad mein. Kubernetes mein, you should not do this. Why? Because every time this and this means the same thing. If you write 100x dev /backend-pg :latest, and if you write 100x dev /backend-pg, दोनों का एक ही मतलब है. What happens is you will keep updating your image. You will keep overwriting the latest वाला tag. तो आपके Kubernetes cluster को पता नहीं चलेगा कि things have changed. Hence, I'm tagging it with :2, :3, :4, :5 as my versions are increasing. So if you go to hub.docker.com /100xdevs whatever backend-pg, that's just the name I've given, you will already see Docker Hub Nginx. Is it at Nginx? What am I missing? I can just log in. I'm sure it's something obvious. I'm not able to get the public endpoint of my image that I have already pushed. So let's see, repositories /100xdevs /backend-pg. There you go. So hub.docker.com/repository/docker/100xdevs/backend-pg. तो ये एक पब्लिक इमेज मैंने पुश कर दी है फॉर एवरीवन ऑन द कॉल, सो यू डोंट हैव टू पुश इट. इफ यू वांट यू कैन पुश इट टू योर ओन डॉकर हब, नो वन स्टॉपिंग यू. दिस इज अ पब्लिक रिपोजिटरी. तो ये सबके Kubernetes क्लस्टर्स में चल जाएगी. इट विल रन इन योर Kubernetes cluster, it will run in my Kubernetes cluster. If you want, you can quickly build the image like this, give it a tag, let's say 2, 3, 4, whatever, and then do a Docker push, push that image to your own Docker hub. I have done it for everyone. So this is like a open source image that all of us can use today. Notice the tags. There is a latest tag. The first time I pushed, then there is a 2 tag, there is a 3 tag, 4 tag. These are like versions that you can create. As your version upgrades, you should also tell Kubernetes कि now please upgrade to version 2, version 3, version 4, like that. We'll see this very soon. But abhi ke liye, backend image deployed on Docker Hub. So step 1 is done. What are we building? Full stack app, frontend, backend, DB in a Kubernetes cluster. Backend written and containerized and pushed to Docker Hub. Step 1 is done. Step 2 क्या होगा? Creating a deployment for the app, and maybe if you want to get fancy, create a namespace for the backend. That's step 2. Let's do a poll. Do we understand the first part? Backend application, containerizing it, deploying it. As you become a DevOps engineer, you are less worried about this. ये full stack वालों का काम है. Let them do all the difficult work. You are the cool DevOps engineer, so you will focus here. Take a minute and try to write it yourself. वैसे तो मैंने लिख रखा है यहाँ पे. So take this as an assignment. कि given ops backend manifest.yaml, I repeat, given ये समझ आ गया सबको. ops backend manifest.yaml को अगर हम खोलें, I already have namespace backend team here. Maybe I just added it right now. I don't think it's on GitHub. If I go to GitHub, if I go to GitHub, do I see this ops/backend/manifest.yaml? I don't see it here, right? तो मैंने locally कर लिया था. I think अभी only I did it in the call. But long story short, you have to create a namespace as well. So can you write the manifest? Let's turn this off. Can you write the manifest for a namespace? Google करो और लिखो. I can do this. kubectl create namespace backend-team, or I can write a manifest for it. So can you quickly try to create a manifest yourself? Given the code, can you write a manifest and can you update this to run in the backend team namespace? चलो ये तो मैंने आपके लिए कर दिया. Second part of the assignment is done over here. How can you make this run in the backend-team namespace? I'm unsure if services can be namespaced. I think they can be. Correct me if I'm wrong. And यहाँ पे you have to write the manifest for a namespace called backend-team. A new namespace called backend-team. You guys will do it. I'm going to wait for you guys to do it, and then someone will post. I will paste it here. Google a little bit. Try to finish this first part of the assignment. Everything is done for you. The deployment has been created. Look at the deployment. It's very simple. What does it say? API version app/v1 kind deployment metadata name backend namespace ये मैंने डाल दिया आपके लिए. Second part of the assignment is done. Create 2 replicas. This is the selector. This is the template. Now this you understand. Last week we did this 5 times. So please tell me you understand the difference between a selector and a template, which are the harder bits there. Sorry, not template. The metadata. This part. So this part and this part is what makes sure कि जो deployment बन रही है, it is aware कि this pod is mine, this pod is mine. Last week किया था, नहीं किया था तो take it as a black box for now. Eventually go through last week's class. We've discussed this in detail. Specification, container हमें एक ही start करना है. That is running what? For me, it's running 100xdev/backend-pg2. Second version of it. For you, it can run the same thing. If you push things to your own Docker Hub, replace this with that, and then the port where the application is exposed. Beautiful. Deployment is done. Service. Here comes the second learning for today. What all were we supposed to learn today? We were supposed to learn could have sworn it was somewhere. Oh, there you go. आ गया था. हाँ. We were supposed to learn about services cluster IP also. ये हमने last week थोड़ा थोड़ा किया था. Last week we understood node port service. We understood load balancer service. आज एक तीसरी सर्विस हम पढ़ेंगे, क्लस्टर आईपी. वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट थिंग. तो स्लाइड्स पे जाएंगे हम अभी, विल अंडरस्टैंड इट. ठीक है. तो ये तीसरी सर्विस जो मैंने बनाई है, द थर्ड नेम स्पेस यू गाइस आर क्रिएटिंग ऑलरेडी, deployment I have created, service that I have created, it has a name. Again, it should run in a namespace called backend attached team. And the specification is कि जहां जहां पे these labels are present, app backend, which is all of these pods that are going to start, वहां पे whenever a request comes on port 3000, send it to port 3000 of that. So जब service का port 3000 hit होगा, port 3000 of the pod पे request will be load balanced. If there are 3 pods, तीनों pods पे request आएगी. Last week किया था, simple stuff. Differences. Type cluster IP. This is new. Last week ये नहीं किया था. We did not learn about cluster IP type last week. You understood? Node port, load balancer. This we did not do. What is a cluster IP service? A service that is only accessible inside your Kubernetes cluster. A service that is only accessible inside your Kubernetes cluster. What are we building today? If these are 4 nodes of my Kubernetes cluster, and this is eventually the DB pod, this is the DB pod. अभी थोड़ी देर पहले I told you कि database should never be exposed over the internet. Database को कभी भी इंटरनेट पे एक्सपोज नहीं करना है, and hence this database will be exposed by a cluster IP service. I'm just writing CIP here. By a cluster IP service, so that other pods, let's say the backend pod, can talk to this internal service and reach the database. External access to the database should not be there. Tabhi this is not a load balancer service, it is not a node port service, it is a cluster IP service. क्या cluster में तो there is an IP to access it, बाहर नहीं मिलेगी. So a front end service, let's say it's in Next.js, can also access the database. The backend can also access the database through this service. Question is, इसकी IP है क्या हरकीरत? What is the IP of this database? We'll come to it eventually. What are we making right now? Right now, we have made a backend that we have also exposed over a cluster IP service. मैंने backend बनाया, I exposed it via a cluster IP service. हरकीरत, तो backend is also only accessible inside the cluster. Yes, for now. We're going to fix that very soon. अभी के लिए the backend is only accessible inside the cluster. No one from outside can hit this cluster IP and hit the backend. So if you put this on the right, if you look at the left, the third service that I have created, this service is a cluster IP service. So it is this thing right here. It exposes something on port 3000, where the target port is port 3000 of the backend container. ये सबको समझ आ रहा है? How does this one file translate to this? Do we understand? Do we understand? कैसे इस एक फाइल जिसमें अभी नेम स्पेस नहीं है हम ऐड कर रहे हैं, there is a deployment which will eventually create 2 pods. Why? Because replicas is set to 2, and there is a service where we have exposed the application on port 3000 that is running the backend pod basically. So something like this. This service is only accessible internally for now cluster में, it is not accessible outside. ये सबको समझ आ गया? Let's do a poll. Do we understand the first file for today? A backend deployment, a front end, a backend service. Third thing that we have to create is a namespace, which I'm sure some of you have. मैं भी quickly लिख लेता हूँ. ये नहीं समझ आया घोड़े कुल के 4 guys, 80 इट्स नॉट टू बैड, 80% कोई इशू नहीं है. Q&A करते हैं, वैसे तो रिकैप ही होगा मोस्टली फ्रॉम व्हाट आई कैन अंडरस्टैंड. तो Q&A, anything specific? Firstly, some people have given the namespace spec, so let me quickly copy it. Thank you. Let me quickly paste it. Kind namespace metadata name something, and I don't know if you need labels over here. I'm keeping it, but I don't think they make sense. I think इतने में काम चल जाएगा. But I could be wrong. We'll see. So API version v1 kind namespace metadata this. Great. Looking at Q&A. Why do we need service? Please explain once more. 74% था, कोई इशू नहीं है, इसी को सॉल्व करेंगे. Because pods are never exposed over the internet, which is something we discussed last week. आपने जो pods चलाए हैं, you can't access them anywhere. app.netexcepts.com, api.netexcepts.com. They are not accessible. They are not exposed by default. If you look at the deployment specification, even though it says container port 3000 here, it says कि यार ये image जो है इसको 3000 पे expose करना. It is not exposed on this machine on port 3000. नहीं है वो. इस container पे port 3000 पे it is sort of exposed. But you can't reach it. No one can reach it. Pods run independently, are not accessible to any other pod or to the internet. To make them accessible is when you introduce a service. The second type of Kubernetes object that we learned. We learned deployment, pods, replica sets, एक side. Then we learned about services last week. Okay, आपको सर्विस बनानी पड़ती है to expose this on the internet. तो ये सर्विस जो हमने बनाई है, इसका name is backend. And the selector is कि जहां जहां पे app is set to backend, which is true for these two replicas. In these two replicas, we have said कि ये labels attach कर देना. So this has app label set to backend. This has app label set to backend. And hence, since the selector says कि यहाँ पे भेजना जहां जहां पे app is set to backend, जब भी कोई request यहाँ आएगी, whenever a request comes up to this cluster IP, it will be load balanced amongst these two. Question that you should have is, हरकीरत ये तो internal है ना, आपने ही बताया कि there are 3 types of services. There is cluster IP, there is load balancer service, and then there is the third type of service, node port. नीचे वाली दोनों actually expose things on the internet, but this ऊपर वाली only exposes things inside the cluster. तो अगर backend pod needs to be accessed by the front-end pod, that can happen through the cluster IP. That can happen through the cluster IP ऐसे. It is still not exposed over the internet. जो हमारा backend pod है, they are not exposed over the internet because cluster IP resource है. कैसे होंगे we will see. But अभी if I replace this cluster IP with node port, अपना काम हो जाएगा. ये हमने last week किया भी था. If we exposed over the node port, we were able to access the backend on an endpoint. If we created a load balancer resource, we were able to access it on the internet. But if you create a cluster IP resource, the name itself is telling you कि यार इसकी एक IP है जो क्लस्टर में accessible होगी, बाहर से नहीं होगी. It will be sort of a private IP. So do we understand what we have done? Of course, it doesn't work right now. We have started backend, not started the database. अभी database को भी start करना है. But do we understand what we have done? Let's do a poll. Did it increase from? Well, maybe before doing the poll, let me look at Q&A one more time. Node pod will expose to every pod to the internet which we don't need. Correct. Service IP port 3000. Bhaiya, tech after DevOps. Any questions? I am not explaining namespace इतने सबको समझ आ गए थे. No questions in Q&A. You understand? Let's do a poll. जल्दी जल्दी let's do a poll. Yash, then we'll proceed. Okay. So 82% understood. That's not great. Any questions? Recap. YAML syntax कैसे आता है? लिखते लिखते आता है. What if my backend image is of 1.2 GB? Will it pose any problem? 1.2 GB is nothing. It'll work. ऊपर से जा रहा है थोड़ा. Cool है. Does target port and container port have to be the same? No. You mean this and this? The answer is no. If you make this 80, तो यहाँ पे request 80 पे आएगी, यहाँ पे request 3000 पे जाएगी. So they don't have to be the same. Recap. All right, quick recap. What did we do today other than learning about namespaces? We wrote a backend app. सबको समझ आई. We deployed it to Docker Hub. सबको समझ आया. We created a deployment in Kubernetes to start 2 pods of this image. I hope समझ आया. चौथे पार्ट पे हालत खराब है. We exposed the backend pods through a cluster IP service. अब ये नहीं समझ आ रहा कि क्या हुआ. We understand there are 3 manifests here. One to create a namespace itself. One to create a deployment that is going to eventually create 2 replicas जो इस pod को रन कर रहे होंगे. कौन से pod को? सॉरी, इस image को रन कर रहे होंगे. And a service. एक बार क्या करता हूँ, मैं इसको अप्लाई करता हूँ. Let me apply this. So let me go to ops/backend. It has a manifest.yaml. वो ऐसी दिखती है कुछ. Creates a namespace. Starts a deployment in a namespace. Starts a service in a namespace. So if I do kubectl apply -f manifest.yaml, you will see error आ रहे हैं कुछ. वो कह रहा है namespace not found. क्योंकि namespace का नाम है backend-namespace और यहाँ पे मैंने backend-team लिखा है. तो let me name this to backend-team and redo it. Let me reapply. It says namespace created, deployment created, service created. तो क्या हुआ इस केस में? तो namespace create हुई, वो तो कुछ logical चीज है. Physically doesn't mean anything. But other than that, what happened अभी? In this step 3 and step 4, in our Kubernetes cluster now, 2 pods have started, pod 1 and pod 2, and a service has been created that is exposing these 2 pods. Where is it exposing it? Is it exposing it on the internet? No, sir. It is exposing it in the cluster. अब cluster में there is nothing else. तो still no one is really talking to these backends, but ये चल जरूर रहे हैं. How do I know? Because if I do k get pods -n backend-team, I see 2 pods are running in crash loop back off. का मतलब क्या है? कि वो चल नहीं रहे हैं. We will debug why. K logs -f backend team -n backend-team. It says ER refused to disconnect. कुछ तो अजीब सा एरर आ रहा है. What is that error? हमारा कोड क्या था? Our code, if you read through it, has a very peculiar line that none of you asked me about. Const pool equal to new postgres.pool. Connection string is postgres : username postgres, password postgres, db.default.svc service.cluster.local : 5432/postgres. ये क्या है भाई? This is the Postgres database URL. अब this doesn't look like a NeonDB URL. This doesn't look like a Superbase URL. So what is this? This is us self-hosting the database. जो database है, this is, let's say worker node 1. And let's say both the backend pods are running here. We want a database pod also running. We want a Postgres pod also running in the cluster. We want our Postgres pod also to be exposed using a cluster IP to these 2 backends. So finally, we see a real use case of cluster IPs. We see a real use case of cluster IPs because ये जो database है, we don't want it accessible on the internet. क्यों? So that if someone gets my credentials, they should not be sitting in Delhi and reading through my database. Even if they have my credentials, they still can't access my database. My database is only accessible inside my Kubernetes cluster. Hence, जो हमें Postgres database बनाना है, we will expose that. Of course, we have to expose it, but we will expose it as a cluster IP. We will not expose it over the internet using load balancer or node port. That is why if you go to ops/db/manifest.yaml, you will notice deployment तो looks very similar. कि यार deployment बनानी है, name of my deployment is db, only one replica I want. This is the selector wherever app db is present. That is my pod. This is the template. कि whenever you start a pod, attach app db to it. And the specification says कि यार एक container बनाओ, name is db, image is postgres image, an environment variable कि postgres का password क्या है. I have simply written postgres. You can name it whatever you want. You can have a random password here. Whatever password you have over here is the password you will have in index.ts over here. है कि नहीं? This is my local database URL. This guy, the backend pod, will talk to the Postgres pod using this service. ये service कहाँ exposed है? It is exposed on db, which is the name of our not deployment, our service. Service पे आएंगे अभी. But ये जो लंबा सा URL मैंने लिखा था, this URL is actually the name of the service dot the namespace where it is started dot service dot cluster dot local :5432. तो Kubernetes cluster में if you have exposed something over a cluster IP, अगर आपने एक Postgres pod को एक cluster IP के थ्रू expose किया है, how will it be accessible to other people? What will the backend put as the URL? It will be name of the service, name of this guy right here, dot कौन सी namespace में चल रहा है वो, default namespace में चल रहा है let's say, dot service dot local dot cluster dot local, whatever port the service is exposing, slash ये तो database का name है, the specific database that you're connecting to. That is why if you look at db/manifest.yaml, sure we are starting Postgres, but we are also exposing it, and type is still cluster IP, port is 5432, target port is 5432. तो target port तो यही रहेगा because the final Postgres image, this Postgres colon latest, starts by default on 5432. But my port I can change. I can make it 3000. Whatever port I put over here, वो ही port यहाँ पे आएगा 3000. If the service is exposed on 2500, then यहाँ पे it will be 2500. If the service is exposed on 5432, यहाँ पे it will be 5432. So now we have exposed a good 80% of the code base explored. We have explored backend. We are exploring database. Database I am starting in the default namespace. मैंने यहाँ कुछ namespace db-team नहीं डाला अभी के लिए, ठीक है? Default namespace में it is starting. This is the deployment. This is the service. What happens when I apply this and this? बैकएंड की मैनिफेस्ट भी अप्लाई कर दूंगा और डेटाबेस की मैनिफेस्ट भी अप्लाई कर दूंगा, तो क्या होगा? दिस विल हैपन. अब पोस्टग्रेस two backend pods will start. One Postgres pod will start. Postgres pod will be exposed via the Postgres service. Backend pods will be exposed by the backend service. ये Postgres service है. This is the backend service. And finally, we learned कि how is internal communication useful, where is it useful, और होती भी कैसे है. If you have exposed something internally, how will a different pod in the cluster talk to it? The answer is, जो भी service आपने start करी है, if that service is of type cluster IP, then a different pod can access that internal service through that cluster IP service by using this as the URL. Name of the service. What is the name of my service? The name of my service was database. If you go to ops/db/manifest.yaml, service का नाम क्या है? db. Service कौन सी namespace में चल रही है? Default. And hence, second thing is the default. the namespace service cluster local colon 5432 because the port where I've exposed it is port 5432. So now we have Postgres exposed locally being used by the backend exposed locally. We need to still expose the backend to the internet. We still need to do this. But before that, we have Postgres running locally, exposed over a cluster IP, being used by a different pod, exposed over a cluster IP. Do we understand this? Let's do a poll. And before we do a poll, abhi ke liye, if you remember, pods are not running. Why? Crash loop back off. Why? Because database is not up. Let me start the database. Let me do Kubernetes apply -f manifest.yaml. Now DB deployment has started. DB service has started. So if I do k get pods, it's still starting. But as soon as the Postgres service starts, that means, deployment starts, that means this has started and the service is exposing it. Backends khud ba khud up ho jayenge. Backends will start because they're crashing and restarting, crashing and restarting. Eventually when they start, they'll be able to discover Postgres. So this line of code that is currently failing will stop failing. This pg.connect nahi hota kya? Whatever. Let's say this line of code is where it is failing right now because it is not able to connect. It will stop to fail, or it's probably this line of code where it is failing as well. But ये fail होनी बंद हो जाएगी क्योंकि database start हो जाएगा. So now as you can see, database is running. So if I do kget pods, DB is running. If I do kget service, I do see DB service exposed. Notice it has a cluster IP. It has an internal IP. अब मैं चाहूं तो मैं ये cluster IP यूज कर सकता हूं. If I want, I can use this cluster IP over here, or I can use this domain name that resolves to that cluster IP. So I can use this or I can use this. Of course, this is more convenient क्योंकि इसमें simply service name, namespace name, so on and so forth. Now, since the database is up, if I now do kget pods -namespace backend, it's still in crash loop back off because वो slowly restart हो रहा है. अभी restart नहीं हुआ है. तो what can I do if you remember? अभी 10 मिनट बाद रीस्टार्ट होगा. इसने बहुत बार ट्राई किया, इसने कहा भाई नहीं हो रहा, तो धीरे धीरे इट्स बैकिंग ऑफ. क्रैश लूप बैक ऑफ. व्हाट डज बैक ऑफ मीन? It will restart in 1 second पहले, then it will restart in 5 seconds, then it will restart in 20 seconds, then it will restart in 2 minutes, then it will restart in 10 minutes. तो अभी कह रहा है भाई I've restarted 6 times, I will wait for some time before I restart. तो I need to force a restart now क्योंकि database up हो गया है. These pods were starting but they were not able to connect to the database. अब database up है, I need to make these pods restart. How can I make pods restart? You can scale deployment backend --replicas 0. You can call kubectl scale deployment, name of the deployment, the namespace it is running it, replicas 0. मतलब मैंने 0 कर दिया replicas. अब मैं फिर से 2 कर दूंगा. I will scale it back up to 2 replicas. So I have restarted or forced a restart for the backend pods. अब वो चल जानी चाहिए. kget pods -n backend team. And as you can see, wait for it. This is running and this is running. If I do the logs, again in the backend team namespace, it says server is running on port 3000. So now these are running, exposed over cluster IP. This is running, exposed over cluster IP. This is able to talk to this. How many of us understand this? How many of us understand almost a full stack application deployed to your Kubernetes cluster? There are flaws in it. If this dies, the data will die with it. So we'll have to fix that eventually. But are we clear? Do we understand this? Let's do a poll. अब सबको तो नहीं, बट मेजॉरिटी जनता को समझ आया. 88% इज गुड, 87% ग्रेट. क्या बच गया गाइस? वन थिंग इज लेफ्ट. वी डिड नॉट एक्सपोज आवर बैकएंड ऑन द इंटरनेट. क्यों? Why did I not expose my backend on the internet? All I had to do was ops backend manifest.yaml में जाके इसको node port करना था या इसको load balancer करना था. Why have I not done this? Let's do this. Let's make this load balancer. Let's reapply the backend manifest. and it says service backend configured. अब मैंने इसको load balancer type का बना दिया है. I made the service load balancer. If you remember from last week, what does that mean? That means कि in my Kubernetes, in my DigitalOcean, a new load balancer has started. In my DigitalOcean, notice ये नई resource start हो रही है अभी. A new load balancer is starting. Why? Because I said कि यार ये service अब load balancer service होगी. तो a new load balancer has started, which will expose my backend on the internet. Beautiful. Now you have a full stack application with the database deployed on the internet. But there are flaws here, which is why this should be a cluster IP. We'll come to that. But अभी के लिए देखते हैं कि does it work? We remember this from last week. If you create a load balancer service that actually starts a load balancer over here, which means you are now paying not just for a Kubernetes cluster, but also for an external resource. ये external resource है जो बन गई है. When you kill your Kubernetes cluster, make sure to delete this as well, वरना ये आपको बिल करता रहेगा. Kubernetes has this concept of cloud controller manager, CCM, which talks to the cloud and starts resources there. Abhi we are starting a load balancer. Eventually we will see how can we use storage in the cloud provider to actually mount Postgres somewhere to the cloud. Eventually Postgres should be persisted, right? It should be persistent. ऐसा नहीं होना चाहिए कि Postgres, if the pod dies and it restarts, the data is lost. Hence we also want to back up data somewhere. Where will that happen? That will also happen somewhere in the cloud. All clouds have some level of storage. You might have heard of EBS, Elastic Block Service, on AWS. There's something called NFS. बहुत तरीके होते हैं. Not need for speed. Network file system. So there are various things you can start inside the cloud using Kubernetes, which is very counterintuitive. क्योंकि it feels like Kubernetes is no longer cloud native. अगर आपको क्लाउड में और कुछ स्टार्ट करना पड़ रहा है, how does that make Kubernetes cloud native? So this is a whole discussion. But again, long story short, सिर्फ cluster is not enough. सिर्फ 5 nodes are not enough. Sometimes you need external resources. Could be a load balancer, could be a storage, could be other things. Abhi we are not doing storage. We have just created a external load balancer. This is the newly created load balancer. If I open it, if I copy the IP, if I go to the IP :3000, I see my backend application deployed on the internet. If I go to /users, I see currently no users exist. If I try to post a user here, if I try to create a new user, so /users post request with a name set to Harkirat and send. Notice new users are being created. If I refresh this now, I see multiple users. So मेरी full stack application deploy हो गई in a very secure way. What makes it secure? Database is not exposed on the internet. The database is only accessible through the backend, only accessible inside my cluster. No one out in the world, even if they have access to my source code, no one out in the world can put this and try to connect to my database. This is not a real URL. This URL only makes sense inside the Kubernetes cluster. This URL only makes sense if it is running somewhere here or here. If I am a hacker and I got this URL, I can't do anything. I can't reach this Postgres service, which is why this is great. You were able to deploy your backend using a load balancer on the internet with database internally hosted in a very secure fashion. But what is the problem? The problem is, let's say we create the front end as well. This is another node. I will eventually start front end pods. Let's say the front end is in Next.js, so the front end is also connecting to whatever the Postgres database. Problem is, front end कैसे expose होगा? Harkirat, create a load balancer service. Yes. So will I create another load balancer service for front end and have 2 different load balancers to pay for? Sure, that is one way. But what if in the future we have another service, a WebSocket service? Will I create a third load balancer? Here comes the concept of ingresses, the concept of an ingress. Even though this works, the problem is, जैसे जैसे आप और services add करोगे, as you add front end, back end, WebSocket service, real time service, video service, transcoding service, 100 different services, you will have too many load balancers here. Why? What is the goal of a load balancer? To take a request and somehow route it to the right place. यही काम होता है कि एक रिक्वेस्ट आई एक लोड बैलेंसर पे, लोड बैलेंसर शुड सेंड इट टू आइदर द बैक एंड पॉड or the front end pod or someplace else. How can we make sure that we don't need multiple load balancers? How can we make sure that एक single load balancer से I can route request here or route request here based on the URL? My friends, we have done this in the past. backend.100x.com, frontend.100xdevs.com. Both point to the same load balancer URL, yet कुछ रिक्वेस्ट यहां जाए बैकएंड वाली, कुछ रिक्वेस्ट यहां जाए फ्रंट एंड वाली. कहां किया है हमने ये पहले? वेयर हैव वी डन दिस इन द पास्ट? लुकिंग एट चैट, वी हैव डन दिस इन द पास्ट कि सेम आईपी बट डिफरेंट वो. Someone said auto scaling groups, that is wrong, but Nginx is the right answer. Reverse proxy is the answer we were looking for. रिवर्स प्रॉक्सी में ये सेम चीज करी थी. क्या करा था? एक बार इसको साइड करें तो देयर वॉज अ वर्चुअल मशीन, वहां पे देयर वॉज बैकएंड प्रोसेस रनिंग, देयर वॉज फ्रंट एंड प्रोसेस रनिंग. वी स्टार्टेड Nginx that was listening on port 80. Request came to Nginx on port 80. Based on the URL, it got routed either here or here. अगर backend.100xdevs.com से आ रही थी तो it routed here. If frontend.100xdevs.com से आ रही थी, it got routed here. Given this knowledge and the fact that we understand how load balancers work, can you build this yourself? इसको बंद करें, इसको बंद करें, इसको बंद करें, इसको बंद करें. We have backend running connected to the database, frontend running connected to the database. Both of them have cluster IP services in front of them. None of them are exposed independently on the internet. दोनों के दोनों internally exposed हैं cluster IP के through. So backend is exposed internally at whatever backend.default.svc.cluster.local:3000. Frontend is exposed on frontend.default or whatever the namespace is .svc.cluster.local:3001 or 3000, let's say. ये समझ आ रहा है पहले सबको कि ये क्या लिखा है मैंने यहाँ पे? Database we exposed, I'm marking green things as services, red things as pods. Database we exposed as a local service, a cluster IP service. Then where was the database accessible? It was accessible on db.default.service.cluster.local. If you remember, when I exposed the backend, I had it as cluster IP. ये तो मैंने अभी दिखाने के लिए load balancer किया, but it was originally exposed as cluster IP. मतलब the backend is also accessible on backend.default, not default. What is our namespace? My namespace is backend-team. So backend.backend-team.svc.cluster.local. है कि नहीं? बिल्कुल है सर. If I create the front end, will be very similar. It will have a namespace section. It will have whatever, a deployment section. It will have a service section. Service will be cluster IP exposed like this on frontend.default.svc.cluster.local: whatever port. So we have internally DB also accessible here. If there is a random pod in here other than these that exist, अगर एक और random pod यहाँ पे है, it can access literally this also, this also and this also. अगर मैं एक random pod start करूं अंदर तो it can access this, it can access this, it can access this. How can I expose all three of these outside through a random pod? Given we understand this a little bit, हमें reverse proxy समझ आती है. We understand if you start Nginx with a specific configuration, it can route requests to specific processes. Can we from first principles try to build our own ingress? थोड़ा complicated है, धीरे धीरे समझेंगे. But before हम समझें, problem statement is clear. we have database exposed. We want it exposed internally only. We don't want it exposed on the internet. Hence, we have exposed it as a cluster IP. We have backend exposed by cluster IP. We will write frontend exposed by cluster IP. Question is, how do we expose these to the world with using load balancers, but not using multiple load balancers? हम multiple load balancers नहीं use कर सकते, which was the original approach we were trying, because then my DigitalOcean will become very crowded. I don't want that. I don't want 5 different load balancers here. एक ही load balancer से काम चलाना है. कैसे चलाएंगे? A single load balancer. Unfortunately, load balancer service में आप कुछ complicated logic नहीं लिख सकते. You can't write this कि यार load balancer service I want to make, and if the request is coming from backend.100x whatever, if the request is coming from backend.100xdevs.com, then route it over here. If the request is coming from frontend.100xdevs.com, then route it to app::frontend. If load balancer services were so flexible, तो हमारा काम चल जाता. अगर load balancer जो सर्विस है इफ ये इतनी फ्लेक्सिबल होती ना कि आप उसको क्लियरली बता पाते कि यार रिक्वेस्ट अगर यहाँ से आ रही है तो राउटेड टू दीज पॉड्स, रिक्वेस्ट इफ इट इज कमिंग फ्रॉम हियर राउटेड टू दीज पॉड्स, कुछ करने की जरूरत नहीं थी, सब यही हो जाता. बट लोड बैलेंसर सर्विसेज आर वेरी क्लाउड डिपेंडेंट. वो इतनी जेनेरिक नहीं बन सकती. एवरी क्लाउड डजंट सपोर्ट दिस स्पेसिफिक टाइप ऑफ राउटिंग, राइट? अब तो वो बहुत जेनेरिक है, उसमें आप इतना कस्टम लॉजिक नहीं लिख सकते कि रिक्वेस्ट अगर यहाँ से आई यहाँ जाए, यहाँ से आई यहाँ जाए. तो गिवन दिस कि एक लोड बैलेंसर सिर्फ एक सेट ऑफ पॉड्स पे जा सकता है, यू कांट रियली राइट कस्टम लॉजिक. इट कैन गो टू वन सेट ऑफ पॉड्स. गिवन दिस, व्हाट शुड आई रन इन दिस पॉड सो दैट अगर रिक्वेस्ट be.100xdevs.com से आ रही है, इट शुड गो टू be.backendteam.svc.cluster.local. If the request is coming from frontend.100xdevs.com, it should go to fe.default.service.local whatever 3001. यहां पे मैं ऐसा क्या रन करूं इस पॉड में? दिस इज ऑल्सो नॉर्मल पॉड, जस्ट लाइक दिस इज अ पोस्टग्रेस पॉड रनिंग पोस्टग्रेस, बैकएंड पॉड रनिंग माय Node.js कोड, फ्रंट एंड पॉड रनिंग माय React कोड. व्हाट शुड दिस रन सो दैट इस पे जैसे जैसे रिक्वेस्ट आए, it is able to understand, अच्छा, this request is coming from be.100xdevs.com, go over here. This can access this. This can't, बाहर से no one knows इसका IP. But if a request reaches here, it can be reverse proxied to a URL here. Reverse proxies don't work just for the local machine. अभी तक, the way we were writing reverse proxies, if you remember, if you remember, we wrote reverse proxies like this. If a request comes here, send the request, proxy the request to localhost:8080. I can change this. This can be google.com. It is a reverse proxy. It can proxy anywhere, not just on the local machine. So do you get where I am sending you guys dhire dhire? What should this be? What should we run over here? An Nginx reverse proxy, right? क्या रिक्वेस्ट आ रही है अगर backend.100xdevs.com से, फॉरवर्ड इट टू backend.backendteam.service.cluster.local:3000. If the request is coming from frontend.100xdevs.com, forward it to frontend.default.service.cluster.local. That way, single load balancer is exposing all of our applications. In the future, if there are more, just change the Nginx configuration here. You are good to go. This is what is called an ingress. You don't have to create it so manually. There are other ways to do it. We will come to that when we reach there. But ये थोड़ा first principles Nginx. Eventually people realized कि or whatever Kubernetes folks realized कि ये करना थोड़ा difficult है. And there are many providers like these. For example, we have only learned Nginx, but there is something called Lecture Proxy. There is something called Traffic. That's Traefic. There is something called Caddy. All of them do the same thing. They all do many things. Load balancing हो गई, rate limiting हो गई. They sit one layer in front of your applications. That's what Nginx does as well. It sits one layer in front of your application. It does SSL termination. बहुत चीजें करता है ये. ऐसी बहुत सारी चीजें. Hence, there is this concept of ingress and ingress controllers in Kubernetes, but that is not what we're discussing today. We are saying before ingress was a thing, ये कैसे होता और ये ऐसे होता. So if you now look at the third folder that I had, this folder has two parts. अब पहला part is something new we will have to learn, config map. आएंगे इस पे, but if you notice कुछ ये है, but in the end यहाँ पे मुझे एक reverse proxy file दिख रही है हरकीत. I see a reverse proxy file very similar to ये जो slides में present है, that we have already done. We have done reverse proxies. We understand this architecture के what's running on port 8080 is Nginx and it's reverse proxying requests पीछे. That is what is happening over here. We understand that. उसकी configuration look like this. Notice यहाँ पे मैंने क्या लिखा है. Very similar configuration. HTTP server listen on port 80. If the request is coming from k8sbackend.100xsteps.com, or let me write it k8sweek32.100xsteps.com, reverse proxy it where? Not to localhost, but to backend, which is the name of my pod. What is the name of my pod? kgetpods -in backend team. Not the name of my pod, sorry. The name of my service. So kget service backend team. I see backend service. ठीक है. Where is it running? Is it running in the default namespace now? No. मेरे लिए तो it is running in the backend-team namespace. So that is what I will write over here. .svc.current.local:3000. तो अब and this is something config maps कुछ होते हैं ये, इनको छोड़ दो, मतलब we'll come to this very soon. But मोटा मोटा समझ आ रहा है कि there is a file written over here. And when I am creating my deployment, तो थोड़ा कंफ्यूजिंग हो आप, क्योंकि config maps मैंने पढ़ा ही नहीं है. We are yet to learn config maps. We learn it in the process. But if you look at the deployment, it's slightly different. इतना तो we understand. इतना तो we have written many times. Kind, deployment, metadata name, ingress, replica 1, selector, template and specification. ये सबको समझ आती है. What am I starting? I am starting Nginx now. इस pod में मैं क्या run कर रहा हूँ? In this new pod, what do we want to run? We want to run Nginx. So I've said create a deployment. Nginx is what we're starting. So image is Nginx. Replica is one. We're starting just one replica. Match labels app ingress. You get the idea. ये हमें आता है already, है ना? Deployment कर रखी है. This is how it knows what are my pods. This is how it's attaching labels to the pods. This is the actual pod specification. थोड़ा सा मैंने extra add किया, which is this. There are two things that I added extra: volumes and volume mounts. ये दो चीजें एक्स्ट्रा ऐड करी हैं. Eventually we'll get into volumes in a little more detail. अभी के लिए, whenever you have created a config map, before that, what is a config map? ये होता क्या है? It's basically a bunch of non-secret, I repeat, non-secret key value pairs. कुछ अगर secret चीज नहीं है, जैसे database password वगैरह नहीं, everything else, which in this case, this is pretty simple. There's nothing I want to hide here. If you have key value pairs, notice key is called nginx.conf. It's not db, it's not password. It is nginx.conf. You can call it whatever you want. This is a key and this is one value. I can add multiple key values here. Okay, password 123, username Harkirat, db, type postgres, so on and so forth. अगर आपको ऐसी बहुत सारी चीजें अपने क्लस्टर में कहीं स्टोर करनी है and you want to use it inside various pods, is where config map comes into the picture. Config map क्या होता है? If I go over here and search for config maps, what are config maps? A config map is an API object. So this is an API object, this is an API object, service is an API object used to store non-confidential data in key value pairs. Pods can consume config maps as environment variables, command line interface and configuration files in a volume. हमें ये तीसरी चीज करनी है. Config map is used in a bunch of places. हम एक पार्ट को यूज कर रहे हैं. हमारा जो Nginx pod है, our Nginx pod needs to have a reverse proxy file. इसके अंदर there needs to be a file at /etc/nginx/nginx.conf. Just like our Ubuntu machine, we have done this, right? हम एक configuration file को update करते थे, where we wrote कि whatever server, and if a request is coming to d.100xdevs.com, then go here, reverse proxy here. ये फाइल हमें इस pod के अंदर पहुंचानी है. We want to make this file reach this pod. I can create my custom image as well. That also works. If all of this is very complicated config map बना दिया, खुद की एक image बना दो 100xdevs/custom nginx. वहां पे put the this file inside that image. That also works. Or the better way to do it is create a config map जिसमें you put your key value pairs in the config map. इससे कुछ नहीं हुआ है, cluster में somewhere these values have reached. Now notice this value is a multi-line value, hence there is a or का आधा over here, whatever it is called. This means कि इसके आगे multi-line comment is coming in or multi-line input is coming. If I don't write this, then I can write a single line input, but if I have a multi-line input, I can add a whatever this is called. So this is the key, this is the value. Now that this exists in the cluster, यहाँ पे मैंने क्या किया है? I have done two things. I have introduced a volume over here. कि यार इस config map जिसका नाम nginx config है, this volume will be accessible to my pods, and I have added a volume mount over here. कि यार /etc/nginx/nginx.conf will be mounted to this nginx.conf path, nginx.conf subpath. थोड़ा complicated सा है, मतलब मैं समझ रहा हूँ. We haven't learned config maps first. We are diving deeper into the most difficult part of config maps. Config maps let you do three things. They let you consume as environment variables, command line arguments, and configuration files in a volume. अब volume भी अपने नहीं पढ़ी है, तो इसका ऊपर से समझ लो. Eventually we will understand config maps from scratch. We'll understand secrets from scratch. तब हमें समझ आएगा थोड़ा ये ज़्यादा. अभी के लिए somehow I had to make this file reach my deployment. तो मैंने किसी तरीके से इस फाइल को यहां पहुंचा दिया है. In this /etc/nginx/nginx.conf, this file now exists. That means the deployment that we are starting now has this reverse proxy file. Reverse proxy file is clearly telling कि यार anytime there's a request that comes to this URL, reverse proxy it over here. We know that this is accessible from nginx. We know nginx exists inside the pod. This code, this nginx server is running inside the cluster. So this can access this guy, and hence there is a reverse proxy that we were able to create. Now, ये जो nginx है, that we want exposed via a load balancer. We wanted to make sure कि एक ही load balancer से सारी applications expose हो जाए. A single load balancer can expose all applications, and we've been able to achieve that by just exposing nginx on the load balancer and बाकी सब reverse proxy based on the URL. If URL is X, reverse proxy here, URL is Y, reverse proxy here, URL is Z, reverse proxy here. Of course, database को हम accessible नहीं करना चाहेंगे, तो only this and this we will try to expose. अभी के लिए I have only exposed the backend. So if you look at the third manifest or third resource here, what is it? The third resource is a simple service, metadata name ingress, selector app ingress, which is the same thing that's provided over here. 80 port पे expose कर रहे हैं. Target port is 80. Type is load balancer. So now only this is of load balancer type. Only nginx is of load balancer type. Backend is of type cluster IP. Database is of type cluster IP. If I create the front end will also be of type cluster IP. Only the reverse proxy or the nginx thingy is of type load balancer. So if I apply this, it says config map created, deployment created, service created. If I do kget service, it tells me एक नई ingress बन रही है. Notice external IP is pending right now. If I do kget service -n backend team, ये load balancer service से exposed था, right? Let me revert that. Let me make this not exposed. ये जो backend pod था, पहले I showed you this exposed by a load balancer. Now it needs to be internally exposed, and hence I've replaced this with cluster IP. I'll go into backend and I'll apply the manifest again. So now it says service has been configured. अब अगर आप सर्विस को देखो, it's of cluster IP. It's no longer of load balancer. In fact, अगर मैं यहाँ जाऊँ तो if I go to load balancers in DigitalOcean now, old वाला बंद हो जाएगा, नया वाला of course start हो जाएगा. So if I go to networking, load balancers, this is the one that is starting, and notice the one that I started like a few minutes ago, 20 minutes ago, it is deleted now. थोड़ी देर पहले I made a load balancer that was talking to the backend. Now that I have replaced this with cluster IP, Kubernetes understands that I need to kill that. So it killed that load balancer, and now I've started a new load balancer that is connecting to Nginx, reverse proxying request over here. अभी start हो जाएगा, तो we will see if it worked or not. I think हो ही गया है वैसे, almost here. So let's wait for it to start, and then let's access it, and then I'll do questions. But do we understand this? Do we understand the concept of, what we did right now? After this, our apps will be accessible on whatever backend, k8s week32.100xsteps.com, and frontend week32.100xsteps.com, and if you want to expose the database, then db week32.100xsteps.com. So uske liye of course I will have to put this DNS entry. So let me do that. Ye load balancer start ho gaya hai. The load balancer is accessible on 64 dot whatever. If I go to it directly, what do you think happens? Is this the old load balancer? Three minutes ago. Ingress is accessible here. Ingress. So even if I don't go right now to this, it is taking me to the backend pod, which is most probably Nginx doing something. I don't know. ये नहीं चलना चाहिए एक बारी में. You get the problem? The problem is whenever the load balancer started, this is the IP of my load balancer. Whenever I'm sending a request to the load balancer, it is sending it to Nginx ka pod. Let's confirm that सबसे पहले. Let's do k get pods, k logs -f. This thing. Let's look at the Nginx logs. As you can see, my request is coming here for sure. If I hit the IP, I see a request here. तो request सबसे पहले तो यहाँ आ रही है. It is coming over here. What I don't understand is why is it being reverse proxied over here? मैंने तो लिखा था only if the server name is this should you reverse proxy the request here. Right now, notice the domain name is nothing. तब भी वो reverse proxy कर रहा है. Probably Nginx is picking a default case, or I don't know. I could be wrong. We'll check कि क्यों हो रहा है. One thing I'm going to do is, or I was going to do was domains. Or if someone knows, just tell me क्या हुआ है. We'll debug it. Let's quickly finish the class. The final thing that's left. Go to domains. Add a new domain at 100xsteps.com. Change a DNS. Add a record. What is the name of what is the IP over here? The IP was this. It is a record here. And what was my reverse proxy URL? It was this k8s week32. So save, and just for kicks, let me add another record, k8s week33, a record with the IP address, same. ठीक है. I've added 2 entries in my Squarespace account. One for k8s week32.100xsteps.com, जहाँ पे I've clearly said if a request comes with this host name, reverse proxy it over here. I've added another one for k8s week33, जहाँ मेरा कोई rule नहीं है अभी. I don't have a rule over here that says K8 as week 33 should point to the, let's say, the front end pod. So if I go here now, it routes me to the right pod. If I go here now, I hope it doesn't work. It shouldn't work, right? उसका कोई rule ही नहीं है Nginx configuration में. And it doesn't work. That is good. Let me add another server block over here. Okay, if the request is coming on week 33.100xsteps.com, then proxy the request to the database. Very scary thing, something you shouldn't do, but मैं फिर भी कर रहा हूँ. db.default dot everything else 5432. Just for kicks, I am changing the Nginx configuration. And what have I done? I have, इसको मैं database पे लेके जा रहा हूँ, इसको मैं backend पे लेके जा रहा हूँ. Sorry, this is going to the backend, this is going to the database. Let's see, does it work? So kget config map, I have Nginx config. I think I'll have to delete it. I don't think I can override it. I could be wrong. So let me try to apply it directly. cd reverse proxy apply -f manifest. So ये configure हो गया, which means this has changed. I will have to restart my pods एक बार ताकि वो नई फाइल को उठाएं. And hence, how do you restart pods? You first scale everything down to 0. And then you scale everything back to 2. So I've scaled everything down to 0. If I go here now, bro, what am I missing? Kget pods dash and team. Oh, it's still terminating, that's why. Let me force delete them. Oh, never mind. Sorry, my bad. Okay, let's just wait for them to terminate. Okay, if I go back here, it's not working anymore. Pods सारे 0 हो गए. Now let me rescale them back up. Now the pod should restart with the new configuration, or with the new whatever reverse proxy configuration, Nginx configuration. जहाँ पे ये भी है, ये भी है. Now if I go to whatever, this, I still reach the right pod. If I go here now, week 33 वाला, which is also pointing to the same load balancer, वो मैंने कर दिया था, right? Week 33, 32 and 33 are both pointing to the same load balancer. If I go here, hopefully it reaches the Postgres database. I don't know if we'll see anything if it reaches the Postgres database anyways. So there's no easy way for us to confirm this. HTTP. No, it did not. Proxy pass db.default.service.cluster.local 5432 week 33. Something weird is happening. Hopefully you guys see it. मैंने दो अलग-अलग, if you look at the reverse proxy configuration, it says if the request comes from here, go to the backend pod. If it comes from here, go to the database pod. यही बोला मैंने. What did I say? I said if the load balancer request is coming from a certain IP, then go to the backend pods. If it is coming from, a certain domain, go to the backend pods. Certain domain, go to the front end pods. Or in my case, I've not done front end pods. I've just said database pod. So ideally, this should be happening. Okay, when the request comes from whatever, K8s week 32.100xsteps.com, it should go to the backend pod. When it comes from K8s week 33.100xsteps.com, then it should go to the database pod. पहले ये समझ आ रहा है कि ये होना क्या चाहिए. What should happen? Do we understand? It's not happening right now. Week 33 is also going to the backend pods. We'll come to why that is. Actually, I don't know. We'll not come to it. We'll debug it together. But बाकी सब समझ आया कि क्या होना चाहिए था, हुआ नहीं. But do we understand what should have happened? Let's do a poll. I'm on the edge of my seat just like you guys. अरे समझ नहीं आया घोड़े कुल के चार. I mean, आ रहा है थोड़ा थोड़ा. 78%, 73%. थोड़ा breathe in breathe out करके Q&A करते हैं 2 मिनट 4 मिनट. Let's do a small Q&A. we'll debug what is happening, and let me know, is it just a recap or is it something else that you guys need? Application still be able, very dumb and not so relevant question, but is it possible not to use any containers and still be able to use Kubernetes? No, it only runs containerized applications. It could be Docker, it could be container, it could be a different runtime, it could be Podman, but you can't run non-containerized applications in Kubernetes. If target port and container port aren't the same, let's say the service port is this and there is a request to see the service, well, port basically means the port where the request to container. Very long question जो आपने लिखा है सुधाक्रिया, can you make it a little smaller? DB HTTP नहीं होनी चाहिए, but you can still try to access it. It'll give you something bad, something weird, but you can still access it that way. Can't we access into Kubernetes and see? We can, but what will that help with? I guess we can do that. You can SSH or whatever, have shell access to a Kubernetes cluster. I'm having a few ideas of how it might help debug, but usse pehle, let's look at Q&A and understand what's up. ठीक है. I don't see any other relevant question. Any questions before I recap the whole thing? Any questions before I recap the whole thing? No questions. ठीक है. एक बहुत complicated सा map है यहाँ पे. मैं शुरू से बताने वाला हूँ ये क्या कर रहा है. I have a express code and I have an ops folder. Ops folder has a backend folder, a DB folder and a reverse proxy folder. Backend and DB हमें समझ आ गए थे. फिर से एक बार quickly बता रहा हूँ कि this is our Kubernetes cluster. It has multiple nodes. Let's say it has 3 nodes. In the very first folder here, backend, I am starting a deployment which starts one backend pod. So let's call it BE1. More backend pod. Let's call it BE2. And a cluster IP service. Can you confirm this? You can go to backend/manifest.yaml and clearly see there is a namespace section. This was just the assignment. There is a deployment I have created. Replicas is set to 2. There is a service that I've created, but notice it is a cluster IP service. This is a service that is exposing some things on port 3000. Basically sending requests here to port 3000 here and here. This we understand. Let me write the other thing as well, which is we have a database cluster IP. We have a single DB pod that is running. We have a single database pod that is running. Any request coming here goes over here. Now our backend talks to our database through this database cluster IP. Our backend talks to this database. How? If you look at index.ts, like this. db.default.svc.cluster.local. db is the name of the service. Default is the namespace जहाँ पे वो चल रही. That is how backend talks to this guy. Now we are creating a new service, simple Nginx service, जहाँ पे we have put a specific file, a Nginx configuration file that looks like this, /etc/nginx/nginx.conf पे. We have put a file which is a reverse proxy file, similar to one we have already written, where we say whenever a request comes to x.100xdevs.com, then go to the pod number 1. When it comes from y.100xdevs.com, go to pod number 2. ऐसा हम बोलने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं. We are telling it कि यार you will be exposed not via a cluster IP service. No. You will be exposed via a load balancer service. And सारी request internet पे जो आ रही है will come through you. So whenever a request comes from the internet, this is like the entry point to our Kubernetes cluster. This Nginx process or pod is what receives every request. Now based on if the URL is this request should go here. If the URL is Y, then the request should go here. इसकी configuration files we have written. If you go backend, there is a deployment and there is a service. Database में if you go, there is a deployment, there is a service. Reverse proxy में if you go, there is something called config map जिसको अभी ignore करो, but notice इस config map में ही configuration file है eventually. This config map, which is something, has a configuration file. There is a deployment. Somehow we have mounted that configuration file here. There is a service which is just exposing Nginx through the load balancer. We also confirmed that every request is indeed coming to the load balancer by putting some logs. हमने यहाँ पे ingress के logs देखे, and I saw whenever I go to this or this or this, I see logs over here, which means सबसे पहले तो request Nginx को hit कर रही है. सबसे पहले the request is being received by this Nginx pod. Question is, Nginx pod is always forwarding the requests here, irrespective of user ये है या ये है, domain ये है या ये है, request सीधा सीधा यहाँ जा रही है. Request is never reaching the second deployment. We don't know why, which is what we have to debug. अब हमें समझ आ रहा है कि सिचुएशन क्या होनी चाहिए थी, क्या है, what should have been the ideal outcome, what is the current outcome, how do we debug it. Let's do a poll. Did we understand the recap? Did we understand the 3 files that have been created and what they are aiming to achieve? They're not there yet, but they're aiming to achieve a single load balancer receiving request based on the domain name, request being routed to either this guy or this guy. How is it being routed? You can just read through the reverse proxy /manifest.yaml and वहाँ पे clearly this manifest is present that is telling you कि यार जब भी request यहाँ आ रही है, go to, so 88% understand that is good. And you know what is it clearly telling? It is clearly telling you कि अगर request यहाँ आई, reverse proxy to backend.backend.html.local. If it comes over here, week 33, then go to a different service completely. But ये हो नहीं रहा है for some reason. So what I'm going to do now to debug, maybe someone already knows. So let me first open Q&A and see if someone already knows. Oh, target port and container port are different things. So let me quickly answer that. What you see over here, container port is just for documentation purposes, like expose in Docker file कि क्या क्या यहाँ से expose करना है. This is like container कहाँ पे expose कर रहा है. Service में target port is कि जब यहाँ request आए वो इसके कौन से port पे जाए. This could have multiple container ports, right? It could have 1, 2, 3 like that. So, you know, this is जब request comes here, which container port should it go to? And when the request comes to 3000, then it should go to 3000 of the other things. That's port and target port. Does anyone already know? I mean, there are a bunch of debugging things that people are putting. So let me do that as well. So, you know, I'll create a fourth thing here. I'll call it front end. Anyways, हमें करना ही था. So let me quickly write front end over here. Let me create a manifest.yaml inside here. Let me do what everyone does as a DevOps engineer, which is copy paste a few things. So मैंने backend manifest पूरी copy करी, यहाँ पे paste कर दी. I'm going to rename this to, the namespace is going to be frontend-team. The thing that I'm starting the deployment is going to be called front end. The labels are going to have app:front end. Container name is going to be front end, and the image that I'm starting, let's say for now, is HTTPD. Very simple default page it will have. And similarly in the service, the name of the service I'm going to write front end. Selector is going to be front end. I think HTTPD exposes on port 80 by default. तो जिसको target port, container port और port नहीं समझ आ रहा है, this is what it is. By default, HTTPD is exposed on port 80. यहाँ पे the target port is going to be 80. The port I'm keeping as 3000. मतलब request जब service:3000 पे आएगी, it will get forwarded to port 80 over here. So that is the difference between container port, target port, and port. ठीक है. Great. So now I think this front-end manifest is good. Of course, in the real world, this would be your own React 100xdev / to-do app front-end image. Abhi ke liye I've put HTTPD. Let's go to front-end and let's apply. So front end manifest has been applied. If I go to k get pods dash n front end dash team, I see 2 pods are creating right now. While they are creating, let me quickly go to ingress. Let me add another server block here. Whenever request comes to, let's call it, ks week 33 frontend .headexsteps.com, तो सबसे पहले इसकी DNS एंट्री डालनी पड़ेगी मुझे. Let me copy this. Let me go to my Squarespace dashboard. Let me add another entry for the same load balancer domain. For whatever week, KDS week 33 frontend. Let me save it. And where should it reverse proxy? It should reverse proxy to name of the service. So k get service dash n frontend dash team, which is frontend. Namespace where it is running frontend dash team dot service dot cluster dot local col 3000. सर्विस के पोर्ट 3000 पे एक्सपोज्ड है. सर्विस के पोर्ट 3000 पे एक्सपोज्ड है. वो जा रही है पॉड के पोर्ट 80 पे, which is exactly what we want. तो if I make this, I don't know, 8080, then I will have to make this 8080. This is the service का पोर्ट, which is this thing right here. It could be anything you want. Target port is the final pod जो चल रहा है उसके कौन से पोर्ट पे दी application is running. So hopefully the ports are a little clearer now. Let's see now. I have updated the config map. So let me reapply whatever, reverse proxy, reapply everything. So the config map has been configured. Let me scale back the, I scaled. You guys didn't even tell me. I didn't restart ingress. I restarted backend. मुझे ingress को restart करना था. This pod, ये जो pod है, इस pod की फाइल चेंज हुई है, right? When I change this file, this is the thing I need to restart. Not these, not this. This is what I need to restart. I was restarting this. Hence, जो मेरी configuration थी वो apply ही नहीं हुई. In fact, we can confirm that. K get pods, K exec dash IT, name of the pod sh, cat slash etc slash nginx dot conf, and you will see week 32 ही है, week 33 है ही नहीं यहाँ पे. The new configuration, this thing was never applied क्योंकि I restarted the wrong pod. I restarted this and this. I was supposed to restart this ताकि नई configuration pick up हो जाए. ये restart होगा तो एक config map नया उठा लेगा. अभी तो it's still running the old config map. तो when I'm scaling, what do I need to scale down? I need to scale down not backend team, but whatever is the name of this deployment, which is ingress. And when I scale up, same. Sorry, it's in the default namespace. Ingress is the name. And if I scale up, I'll scale up the same thing. Now, if I see this newly created pod, this newly created ingress pod, if I go inside this cat slash etc slash nginx, you will see I have week 33 frontend also here. अब नई configuration apply हो गई है. Now if I go here, it reaches HTTPD, तो चल गया. तो if I go to week 33 frontend headexsteps.com, it reaches HTTPD. If I go to week 33, it says bad gateway because it's trying to reach my database, which Postgres है वो. And if I go to week 32, it reaches the backend. So now KTS week 32.headexsteps.com goes to the backend pod. 33 goes to the database pod, and 33-FE goes to the HTTPD pod. So समझ आ गया? The only thing that's still confusing to me is if I go to the IP directly, why does it go to backend by default? ये मुझे थोड़ा confusing लगा. Probably because I have missed some strictness check over here. I have to change something here. Strict equal to true. कुछ तो ऐसा डालना है. That will make sure कि if there is no domain, it gives a 404 page. अभी के लिए if there is no domain, it is getting routed to this very first service. I would assume पहली वाली पे जा रहा है. अगर मैं पहली वाली को ये बना दूँ, if I make the very first service this, and then again apply manifest.yaml, and then I scale to 0, and then I scale back up. Whatever, I should just scale to 1. वैसे so scale to 0, scale to 1, and now if I go here, it probably goes to, I don't know, it goes to HTTPD. Yeah. So there's something in Nginx. Okay, if you just give the raw IP address, it goes to the very first one. But if you give it the actual, domain name, then if the domain is this, it comes here. If the domain is this, it comes here. If the domain is this, it comes, here. So cool. Do we understand things we've discussed today? 10 बज गए हैं. I'm sure you guys are exhausted already. But to recap, we learned about Mota, the biggest thing we learned is how to deploy a full stack app with a single load balancer on a Kubernetes cluster without using ingress controller, with DB only accessible internally. Mota, this we have learned. Great interview question to ask. But next week we'll understand what are ingresses, which make all of this a little easier. Ingresses and ingress controllers work very similarly under the hood. Under the hood same ही चीज़ हो रही होती है. थोड़ा आसान हो जाता है वो चीज़ करना दो. तो I'll come to what that is next week. But that's all I had. Hopefully you guys understood. Code is already out there. I've updated it a little bit. Let me not post that. It's a mess. But the code that's out there is enough to build this. Hopefully you understand the concept. Then you can write things yourself. And you can make this more. अभी मैंने सिर्फ backend deploy किया. Front end भी बना सकते हो. Front end भी deploy कर सकते हो. And make it all accessible everywhere. But that's all I had. Let's do a quick poll. And meanwhile, I'm also opening chat so we can answer questions. Did we understand everything? Yes or no? While you guys answer, I'm going to open chat. Yeah, let's do it. All right, समझ आ गया है. Beautiful. 89%, 90% is great. Lot of Notion docs. No real questions anymore, which is good. Kulya, Sim. Okie dokie. Om Sharma is here. You have been forwarded to Novostack, so let's see. Make your profile. Dying to create offline videos. Trust me, no one wants this more than me. Okay, we finish the code soon. Just not getting the time. Tuesday I'm traveling to the US. I doubt I will get time there. So tomorrow is all I have, where I have to go to construction site and do Mazduri. So we'll see. Cool. I think I've opened all of them. Come on, open. Okay. Cool. Let's start. This is beautiful. You are Om. Don't worry. You'll get. I'm referring, so don't worry. If not, no stack somewhere else. But I think they should take you with open arms based on this project. So it's just about the interview and when that happens. Cool. Very good. And keep at it. And also change the logo. You got that. Whatever. Sorry, I keep forgetting names. But yeah, I do remember you. And ho jayega. They will start. Everything will start together. But probably sometime next week. Maybe not next week. Maybe a week ke baad. The F3 triggers SQS. Yes. Continuous running EC2 listening queue. Okay. One small problem here is what if it crashes? What if whatever you're picking from SQS, you pick it up, but you're not able to transcode it for whatever reason. Server crashed, file was too big, so on and so forth. How do you replay that event? I don't see that here. Start ECS and spin Docker containers to process the transcode. Why do you have EC2 in the middle? You can either do ECS or you can do EC2. Why do you need both? Everything else is fine. Replay logic is not there. I don't understand why you have two different services. Yeah, that's it. That's the only difference. Everything else is perfect. You don't have replay logic. So generally, the way this would be done would be either you use something like celery, which is the most elegant way of doing it, because there you can have retries and everything if something crashes. If something is not processed, if an event is not processed in, let's say, 5 hours, it will be retried. That is not true in your Go. If you pull from SQS and you're not able to finish transcoding in 2 hours, it doesn't get repulled and retranscoded, right? That's one problem. Other problem is I don't understand why do you have both ECS and EC2. You only need one. Everything else is good. Uh, okay, so big one. So I will come back to it. Feel like I saw this in today's webinar thingy as well. Um, okay, if you are a front-end engineer, I would not call that great. Uh, yeah, this is definitely not great. Honestly, the quantity is high. I get it, but I don't see one that is very clean. So if if you're looking for a referral, probably not. Yeah. Anything else that you're looking for? Oh, sorry, band ho gaya wo. Oh my God, it's too much pressure. Well, before responding, I was thinking of creating a Verse-like application. Oh God, not usual S3 store one in which user is able to deploy Nexus backends as well. Thus, actually providing them from a server. Should I use Kubernetes or auto scaling? For attention, I created this in 2 weeks. So let's see. Do not understand this. What is Nova here? How is WebSocket talking to Nexus? Okay, Kubernetes is better. Why? Rather than EC2, number one, biggest reason, resource utilize. So, what you really want to build, if you're building this, is not Vercel, it's something else. It is what? It is a serverless provider. आप एक्चुअल में क्या बना रहे हो? आप एक serverless provider बना रहे हो. क्यों? क्योंकि you are letting people deploy applications which require some server, right? It's not as easy as a CD and an S3. So if you are doing that, that means thousands of people will create thousands of projects. You can't have thousands of pods running for them. If no one is visiting an application, you should have 0 pods. When someone hits the application, you should increase the number of pods. So what you want to do is something closer to a serverless provider and further from Vercel. That's the challenging bit. ये समझ आ रहा है क्यों? Because you will have thousands of applications that people will deploy on you. Sure, there is a pipeline that happens before, but after they deploy, they need to be alive on the internet forever. That means you need to have thousands of pods and hundreds of machines running forever. You can't sustain that. Most of these projects no one is hitting, and hence that is why it's easier to do S3 plus CloudFront, right? You pade hain, they're not running, there is no server running. Here you have a server running, so you can't run it infinitely. You need to have okay, you got the answer. It's cool. What's the link? I mean, it's good. I'm not logging in with my GitHub, but I'm sure it does what you're saying it does. And if you have Git hooks and everything, that's nice. Where as soon as I commit, it automatically reaches somewhere. Cool. Standard questions, I would assume. Changing it to floating view. Oh, I don't know how I do this, but I'm sure someone from the team will help me. Stored on chain. This okay. This is a Web3 question, right? And to answer your question, it's stored in memory. There are snapshots stored on disk as well. But most of your state machine, be it Ethereum state machine or Solana state machine, is present in memory. If this was a Web3 question, which I am assuming it was. Next.js server is VS Code taking so much RAM. Yeah, not much you can do. Next.js is, I mean, I don't know. You probably don't have the best machine then, because a Next.js simple server shouldn't take much. In Ethereum, you don't. And the answer is so even in Solana, you only use Solana or Ethereum for incentivization. So, time to time people pull out funds, your tokens from there. That's it. So, other than that, you would not really use, like, what is DeepIn? It's like people providing infrastructure or something else. You need to pay them. You use Solana for that. You use Ethereum for them. Other than that, the Ethereum protocol, the Solana protocol helps nowhere. Maybe one place you would want it to help would be कि on chain store होगा कि बंदे ने कितना use किया, how much humidity data I provided, things like these. Those may be stored on chain. You don't need them, but sure. उसके लिए Ethereum and Solana make same thing. Of course, Solana it will be cheaper. Ethereum will be very expensive to store things on chain, but that's it. On Rust native contract, so it did not happen. But what did we do Friday? Friday we did PDAs. So now that we know PDAs, I'll do a whole one. Okay, Hello Bachcho was also doing a college-like startup. What's Hello Bachcho? PWIOI. Cool. Well, they've been doing it before us. They've been doing it for 2 years. Bounding the cohort. Yes, I know. I just need more time. Let me finish the syllabus really quickly, either offline or live, and then we can do whatever you guys want. Again, not for a while. I think if there are other projects I need to focus on. This was just a random project I built. Wasn't really something I'm pursuing though. I don't remember all my passwords. Email WebSocket Python as a API. So good for you. I'm sure if you want me to look at it or what. But what is it doing? Like, I'm less interested about it being a WebSocket Python server and more interested about what it does. Done. It's just a project, not just a project, it's a project. So that's great. Looks very comprehensive. Where is the link to the live link? I'm sure there's a bunch of things I can't really, no. Is there a live link? Seems like there isn't. Great. I would love to see a live link as well. What is it? You have to give me some context on what it is before I give you feedback. I see some AI wrapper with a bunch of other things. Oh, is it like, I don't know, is it interviewer or something like that? I don't know. I'll keep it open, add more details as to what the project is. This I did, right? I did. This I didn't do. You have put my Notion doc in the last class. What did I bookmark it for? See, I forgot. This failed, right? We tried yesterday. You did not have OT, operational transforms in there. You were trying this yesterday or whatever day before yesterday it broke. So cool, but like I'll keep it bookmarked for a while. You'll have to remind me later. My company is hiring. All right, time to reach out. Great way to make me follow you on Twitter is just tell me your company is hiring, and there I will be in your DMs. Cool. Oh shit, I should also message you. I will forget. Hey, do you have a JD? You should probably talk to Om. This is good. This is like co-founder matching. I don't think Om has experience, but you should see his project. Like, he built a Collab draw, whatever that thing is. It's great. Om kaha hai tumhara Notion doc? Or I'll just DM you Om's number, and that will probably be the easiest. But you should talk to him. I can't say he's experienced nahi hai, but he's smarter than experienced folks, I would say. So his number is क्या प्राइवेट चैट में फोटो डाली है 8789 याद आ गया मुझे कॉल पे हूँ अरे 8789 alright Om from cohort oh sorry different number कितने ओम हैं sorry wait not that वही तो मैं कहूँ क्योंकि मैंने वो नो स्टैक से दूसरे को कर दिया था फिर ओके 89999292 3 लेटर हम नहीं बताएंगे बट गुड टू गो ओम्स नंबर ठीक है आई हैव कनेक्टेड यू टॉक टू हिम ही इज गुड नहीं मिलता था आई कैन कनेक्ट यू टू मोर बट आई थिंक ही इज टॉप ऑफ द स्टैक राइट नाउ perfect this is like good co-founder matching we should do this online until construction हाँ तो ऑनलाइन क्लासेस चल रही हैं बट यू गाइज इफ यू आर अटेंडिंग दिस क्लास You will not be, I mean, school ki chal rahi hai, tumhari nahi. Super 30, nothing has started. I don't have time right now for the next 20 days to take online classes either. Uske baad we'll start, whatever, online or whatever. And, this time I'm going to filter a lot. The biggest feedback was that crowd could have been better. So why am I going to filter on the crowd this time? Okay, everyone is good. All right, where is that big person doc? हाँ ये तो हो गया था. Read this full, otherwise you're not a good teacher. तो वो बंदा कौन था कि there is a very big dog. Okay, there you go. Oh, I want to know these things. Okay, I have a node server of APIs which I want to deploy in a virtual machine. Okay, so my virtual machine is 10 cores, but just single thread machine. So even if I use machine, it is waste. Correct. How to scale? Cluster module. We've done a class on this. So use the cluster module. It'll start 10 processes. It'll start to route request to each one of these. Well, architecture दोनों बता देना in detail. कोई production level नहीं है इसमें. That's all you can do. If it's a Node.js process, you can start manually 10 different Node.js processes, put Nginx on top and route request to them, or use the cluster module in in Node.js. We have done a video on it, and it'll start 10 processes. तो आपके सारे core use होने लग जाएंगे. How can we implement prescription image PDF to extract info and save in JSON format? You'll probably have to use some API. There is one that I used for maths. So we have a bunch of math PDFs that we wanted to convert to text. We use something for that. I would assume something similar. Like there's some API that you have to use. Don't know how to build a image recognition model from first principles, because PDFs are not images, right? They're not exactly text. They have more very obfuscated hoti hai wo. So you can't simply convert a PDF to text. You'll miss out on a lot of things, a lot of context, and hence you have to do some level of image to text. Okay, 4 roles. There are 2 approaches to implement role-based authentication. Only 1 table per user, separate patient table. Perfect. And here is a very, one of the biggest questions I have what's the word? Have had a healthy discussion with co-workers on should users and admins table be separate or not? And the answer that I have is yes. I'm sure there are some people would prefer one over the other. I prefer separate tables, so admin table different. Biggest reason is you will most probably have separate admin UIs and separate user UIs, and an admin might want to log in as a user. For example, I have an admin UI for my course where I upload videos. I am a user there as admin, and then I have harkira.classes.co.in where I want to use the same email. So if the email field is unique, then this becomes problematic. So either you have uniqueness constraints that are not on email but email plus role. That is one approach, or just have to separate tables works. I would use separate tables. I would use approach number 2. So why का कोई good answer नहीं है. There are pros and cons to both. If you use the first approach, then you have a single table, easy to manage. If you use the second approach, there are multiple tables, but it actually gets easier. But your queries change everywhere. So वो ये दोनों के pros and cons हैं. Would not matter. Very small thing to optimize for. But I would use the second one. Should I use Clerk? I don't know. You should probably just do it in house. Cool. International payment gateways. Okay. How do you handle multiple book same appointment same time? So that's a very hard problem. You have to lock. So just like one of the most difficult questions of computer science, what you're asking me right now. Okay, how do you solve whatever? Not computer science, but whatever application level. How do you build an application where multiple people from all around the world are trying to book the same thing at the same time? How do you process it? There are multiple ways, right? I have a live stream on YouTube where I was trying to book my show. This was the problem we focused on. I thought of one architecture. Coldplay concert when there was a different architecture that we used. But long story short, you just have to process all the events sequentially, right? वही है कि आप हर event को sequentially process करो. Unfortunately, अगर किसी बंदे ने एक सीट को block कर दिया है, तो अगले 10 मिनट तक that seat is blocked, irrespective of if he pays or not. Even if they don't pay, then also 10 minutes तक seat is blocked. If they do pay in the 10 minutes, then they get the confirmed seat. Same is true for flights. If you're booking a flight, then Make My Trip lets you book flights. Ease My Trip lets you book flights. So how do you make sure that Indigo ka database, if there are 2 people in both the websites trying to book the same seat, how do you make sure Indigo ka database doesn't honor both the requests and doesn't book the same seat for both of them? So this gets one step further when you have an application like this, where it's not just you talking to your database, it's you talking to Indigo that is actually booking the flights. That's probably true for Book My Show as well, because you book My Show, Paytm, District can all book the same seat in a movie theater, right? In a movie theater, all three of these can book the same seat. So what if this guy is saying, I want to book B1, and then there's another guy wanting to book the same thing? What happens then is a interesting challenge. And there is this thing called distributed transactions, if you've heard of it. You understand transactions. If I pay 100 rupees, I want to make sure I get the ticket. But in this case, payment is coming from Razor Pay. Seat booking is happening on Book My Show. So this is a distributed transaction. कि दोनों चीजें या तो साथ में होनी चाहिए या फिर one of them should roll back. So if someone gives me money but that seat becomes unavailable on the theater, I need to refund them the money. So it's a very interesting challenge. Difficult challenge. No easy architecture, no standard answer. You can decide based on, in your case, it's table booking. It's much easier. You're not dependent on a separate service. Just in a single thread sequentially process all the requests and you're good. सारी requests को जो database को hit कर रहे हैं for seat booking, just make them go sequentially. You don't have payments, right? People select the seat, they get it. When you select the seat and then you have to pay for it and you have 10 minutes to pay is when it becomes a problem. This is an easy approach. Just lock that specific row before you're updating it. Cool. Very difficult. Cool. Alrighty. Cool. We'll call it here, guys. Thank you all for joining. I will see you guys next week from a different location, New York, baby. And we'll go from there. Chalo. Have a good night, folks. Bye-bye.